James Walker sat alone in the corner booth by the window. Big man, not tall, but built like someone who had spent decades doing things that required a strong back. Head shaved clean, gray beard down nearly to his collarbone. His leather vest was old, the kind of old that speaks of decades, not fashion. Patches on it, some faded, some cracked at the edges. If you knew what you were looking at, each one told a chapter of a life most people would never understand. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, a folded newspaper beside it, and his eyes, dark calm, the kind that had seen enough to stop being surprised, resting somewhere near the window. He wasn't bothering anyone. He never did. The bell above the door jangled at 2:30. Emma Reed, the waitress who'd worked the afternoon shift at Henderson's for 11 years, looked up from the counter. Her jaw tightened, barely but enough. Julius Mercer entered first. Mid-50s. Business casual that cost more than most people's rent. The tan of a man who golfs. The posture of someone who has never once been told no. Behind him came Vivian, his wife. Oversized sunglasses indoors, silk blouse, the energy of a woman who treats every room she enters as a stage built for her. The Mercers had property 20 miles outside Harlow Creek. 3 years of coming through town. 3 years of being genuinely despised without seeming to notice or care. People remembered the way Vivian had publicly berated a teenage cashier at the hardware store. They remembered Julius's lawsuit threat against a 60-year-old farmer over a fence line 2 inches off. Scene after scene after scene. The Mercers moved through this town like they owned it, and they left wreckage behind them the way a river leaves mud. The diner settled into hell-breath quiet when they walked in. Vivian scanned the room the way a person scans a buffet, looking for something worth picking up. Her eyes passed over every booth, every stool, and then landed on James Walker. Something lit up in her face. Julia saw it too. They slid into the booth directly beside James, past 3 empty ones to get there, and settled in with the deliberate ease of people who had done this before. Hank Sullivan, the diner owner, came out from the back with a dish towel over his shoulder. He looked at the Mercers. He looked at James. He looked at Emma with an expression that said everything that couldn't be said out loud. Vivian started quietly enough. A comment to Julius about the smell, then the decor, then, loud enough to carry, about the type of people one runs into in places like this. Julius smiled the way men smile when cruelty is aimed at someone else. James did not look up from his coffee. Nice vest. Vivian's voice cut across the table. Halloween already? A few people looked away. Emma stopped moving. Julius leaned forward. Hey, biker. My wife paid you a compliment. Still nothing. You look like a man who peaked in 1987, Vivian said. What happened? Did the gang kick you out when you got old? Julius laughed. 2 people near the door quietly gathered their things. James set down his cup. He looked at Vivian, just for a moment, with those dark, still eyes. Then he went back to his paper. That was when Julius decided he needed to make a point. He picked up the glass of red wine he'd just been served, stood up, stepped the 2 feet to James's booth, and poured the entire glass over the old man's head. The wine ran down James's skull, down his beard, soaked in his collar, dripped from the table onto the linoleum. A woman near the window put her hand over her mouth. Hank Sullivan went completely still. Emma gripped the counter edge. Julius set the empty glass down with a small, satisfied click. James didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly enough that you could feel the whole room holding its breath, he reached up and wiped his face with a paper napkin. Folded it, set it down. Then he stood up, turned and looked at Julius Mercer with the patience of a man who has been expecting something for a very long time. And then James Walker spoke 7 words that would destroy everything the Mercers thought they knew. For years I hoped the stories weren't true. Nobody moved. Julius blinked. Vivian's smile faltered. They had expected rage, shouting, a threat, maybe a call to their lawyer from the parking lot. They had not expected those 7 words delivered in a voice that was quiet, steady, and somehow more unsettling than anything loud could ever be. Because James hadn't said them to Julius. He had said them to himself, like a man who had just confirmed something he had quietly been dreading. He sat back down, picked up his coffee, took a slow sip. The wine was still drying in his beard. Here is what those 7 words meant. James Walker had heard about the Mercers. He had heard from neighbors, business owners, a widow named Dorothy who still couldn't talk about her own encounter without her voice breaking. Story after story about this couple. And every time, James had told himself, surely it wasn't as bad as they said. Surely no one could really be like that. He had chosen patience, had chosen to believe in people before the evidence was in. And the evidence was now dripping off his chin. The Mercers had no frame of reference for any of this. They were still expecting the crowd to be in on their joke, but nobody was laughing. The expressions Vivian was encountering were ones she hadn't seen before, at least not directed at her. Something close to dread, something close to pity, but not for James. Emma Reed stood behind the counter gripping a coffee pot she had forgotten she was holding. She had known James Walker for 9 years. She knew what he was. She knew what that vest represented. And she was staring at Vivian the way you stare at someone who has just stepped onto a frozen lake and is still smiling because they haven't heard it crack yet. James reached into his shirt pocket and sent a short text. Then he put the phone away, folded his hands on the table, and waited. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because you're going to want to see exactly where this goes. To understand that afternoon, you have to go back. James Walker grew up in Braddock, Pennsylvania, a mill town slowly exhaling since the steel collapse. Oldest of 3 kids. Father worked the furnace. Mother worked the school cafeteria. He enlisted at 17, came back from Vietnam 2 years later quieter, heavier behind the eyes, carrying things he would never fully put down. His younger brother Danny didn't come back at all. Danny Walker died in 1971, 22 years old, 6 months from the end of his tour. James spent the better part of the next decade trying to outrun that grief in ways that nearly destroyed him. The drinking, the fights, the jobs he couldn't keep. He wasn't a good man in those years. He was an honest man who couldn't yet find a reason to be good. The Brotherhood found him in the mid-70s. A Hells Angels chapter came through Braddock. Their mechanic had broken his hand, and James spent 3 days working their bikes without complaint. They liked the way he worked. No shortcuts, no unnecessary conversation. The look of a man who intends to solve a problem rather than avoid it. They invited him to ride. He said yes. And something in that, the structure, the loyalty, the code of belonging to something that asked real things of you, settled a piece of James Walker that had been loose for years. He rose steadily, not through violence, though he was capable when required, but through the kind of quiet authority that comes from a man who means exactly what he says. By his 50s, his name carried weight across 3 states. Not feared like a weapon, respected like a courthouse, because what happens inside it has real consequences. But here is what the people of Harlow Creek knew that nobody else did. James Walker had paid Frank Delaney's surgery bills when the VA wouldn't cover it. He had organized charity rides that raised tens of thousands for local food banks. He had quietly, always quietly, funded a youth mentorship program that kept kids out of the system. When the VFW hall in the next county lost its roof to a storm, James showed up with a crew, materials, and 3 days of labor. He never announced any of it, never asked for credit. He just did it because it needed doing. That was the man sitting in the corner booth with wine drying in his gray beard. And Vivian and Julius Mercer had not done 5 seconds of research before choosing him as that afternoon's entertainment. Julius, not knowing what to do with the silence, decided to press it. "I think the old man is confused," he said to Vivian, loud enough for the room. "Maybe someone should call him a cab." Vivian smiled. That was when Frank Delaney pushed himself up from his counter stool. Frank was 73. He walked with a cane. He wore green work pants, a plaid flannel shirt, and a VFW cap every day of his life. He turned to face the room and said, in a voice that had lost nothing to age, "James Walker paid for my surgery. Both knees. The VA wasn't covering it. I was looking at 2 more years, barely able to walk. James found out. I never told him directly. Word got around. And 3 days later, there was an envelope in my mailbox. No name on the return address. But I knew. Everybody who knows James knew." He looked at Julius. "That's who you poured your wine on." Julius opened his mouth. Emma Reed set down the coffee pot. "He kept my family's business open," she said quietly. 3 years ago, my mother's bakery, 22 years on the same block. Her landlord raised the rent to push her out. We couldn't afford a lawyer. James heard about it, walked into that landlord's office, and whatever was said in that room, we never knew. But the rent came back down, and we never had a problem again. He never asked for a single thing. From the back booth, Tyler Brooks, 26, compact, serious-faced, said, "James gave me a job when nobody would return my calls. I had a conviction at 19. He didn't care. Taught me everything I know about engines. Told me the only thing your past should do is teach you, not define you." Tyler looked at his hands. "About my own shop now. 3 employees. That doesn't exist without James." The diner was silent except for the ceiling fan. Julius looked at Vivian. For the first time, something had cracked in his expression. Not remorse, more like recalculation. Like a man trying to figure out if the numbers still add up. The door opened. Sheriff Cole Maddox walked in. Lean man in his early 60s. Long history with James Walker. Not uncomplicated, but built on the kind of mutual respect that develops between 2 men who have made hard choices in difficult jobs and recognize something honest in each other. He crossed to the counter. Emma filled his coffee automatically. He took a slow sip. Then he looked at Julius. "Julius Mercer," he said. "I was hoping I'd run into you." Julius straightened. "Sheriff." "Good. I was about to report." "So was I," Cole said. "We've been collecting reports on you and your wife for 7 months. Harassment complaints, public disturbance, 2 civil cases that got quietly settled, 1 restaurant incident in Clearfield County with 3 witnesses on record." He let that land. "This diner has cameras. Whatever happened here today is already recorded." Julius looked up at the camera above the register. He had not noticed it until that moment. "This isn't the first complaint involving you two," Cole said, "but it might be the last one I take sitting down. If you're tired of watching people like the Mercers move through life thinking they're untouchable, hit that like button and subscribe. People like them count on good people staying silent. And we're just getting to where the silence ends. Julius recovered fast. Men like Julius always do. He straightened his jacket, placed his hands flat on the table, and said, "I'd like to speak with my attorney." "You're welcome to," Cole said. "No one's stopping you." Vivian turned to James. Whatever she was attempting, Maybe a managed apology, maybe charm wasn't landing. "We can make this right," she said. "We can talk about compensation." "Keep your money," James said. "I'm sure we can." I said keep it. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and set a small, worn notebook on the table. 7 months ago, he said, I started hearing things about a couple in Westbrook County who seemed to enjoy hurting people who couldn't afford to fight back. Elderly, disabled, working people, people who wouldn't make news. He tapped the notebook. I'm old enough and stubborn enough that I needed to see it with my own eyes. Vivian stared at the notebook. I've been in 4 public places over the past few months, James said. Alone, looking exactly like what you think I look like. Waiting. He paused. Today was Wednesday, and here we are. This is the first real twist, and you need to let it settle. James Walker, a man who could have responded to those rumors in a dozen harder and faster ways, had instead chosen patience, had chosen documentation over instinct. He had sat in diners and waiting rooms and parking lots. This old biker with a gray beard, waiting for proof. Not revenge. Proof. And Vivian and Julius had walked right into a room he had been quietly preparing for months. One by one, over the next 20 minutes, more people began arriving. Dorothy Haynes, 71, hadn't been to Henderson since her own encounter with the Mercers, wearing her good blue coat. The hardware store owner, the pharmacist, the young woman who had been the teenage cashier Vivian humiliated 3 years ago, now 19, and working her way through community college. They came in without drama, just arrived, the way people arrive at a place they were told to be. They were the stories. Every one of them was a page from that worn notebook. In watching them settle into booths around him, James thought about Danny. He always did at moments like this. His brother who died at 22 and never got to sit in a diner and grow old and become aggravating and devoted to something. James had spent 30 years building a world where the people Danny might have protected, if he'd lived, got protected anyway. He had never said that out loud to anyone, but it was the engine under everything. Here is the part that changes everything. James had not come to Henderson's diner that Wednesday for surveillance. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, in the back room that Hank Sullivan had been quietly decorating since early morning, there was supposed to be a community gathering, a surprise tribute, 3 months in the planning, to honor James Walker's 30 years in Harlow Creek. The whole town, veterans, families, former kids from a mentorship program, now grown with their own children, teachers, business owners, everyone whose life had been quietly changed by this man. He had been told to come to Henderson's at 2 o'clock under the pretense of a VFW scheduling meeting. Frank Delaney had been delivering that lie straight-faced for 3 weeks. So James had arrived, and the Mercers had arrived, and what was supposed to be a celebration had turned into something else entirely. Something that, in its own way, ended up being a more honest tribute than anything planned could have managed. At 10 minutes to 5, Hank Sullivan came out of the back. He looked at the Mercers. He looked at James. And he said, with the quiet authority of a man who has spent 3 months planning something and is absolutely not going to let 2 unpleasant people ruin it, James, I think it's time. The back room doors opened. They were packed in, more than the space was built for. Teachers, veterans, young parents with kids on their hips, former students now grown, a pastor, a nurse, a retired firefighter, and a sound that came from that room when they saw James standing in the doorway. It wasn't a cheer exactly. It was more personal, the sound a group of people makes when they are genuinely, privately glad. James stood in that doorway with dried wine on his vest and said nothing for a long moment. Then, from outside, the sound started, low at first, like distant thunder rolling in from the west, but growing. The unmistakable rumble of motorcycle engines. Not one, not 10, not 20. Dozens. Getting louder, getting closer, coming down Main Street in a procession that brought people out of every business on the block. Rider after rider, two by two, chapter brothers from across 3 states who had driven hours for this. Moving with the particular dignity of men who understand that some moments deserve to be taken slowly. They parked in a line that stretched 2 blocks down Main Street. Vivian Mercer stood at the diner window and looked out at that line of motorcycles, and something shifted in her face, something real, maybe for the first time all day. Julius had gone quiet in a way that was different from the calculated quiet of earlier. This was the quiet of a man genuinely recalibrating. James walked back through the diner. He stopped in front of them. He didn't raise his voice. "You poured wine on my head," he said. "That'll wash away. But every person you stepped on to feel important, that's harder to clean." He held their eyes for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the back room where the people who loved him were waiting. The room erupted. The weeks after that Wednesday moved the way real consequences move, slowly, thoroughly, without drama. The documentation Cole Maddox had been building quietly gained weight. 3 more witnesses came forward within a week, emboldened the way people get when they realize they are not alone. The civil proceedings were not fast, but they were thorough. Julius's development deal in Harlow Creek, the one that had depended on goodwill he no longer had, fell apart. Quietly, completely, in the way small towns can make things fall apart when they decide to. Vivian eventually wrote letters, one to each person in that room. Whether they said what needed to be said is not something James discussed publicly. But Dorothy Haynes, the widow in the good blue coat, said hers made her cry, though she couldn't fully explain why. That evening, James received the tribute the town had planned, stood in Hank Sullivan's back room for 3 hours, talked to everyone who wanted to talk, shook every hand, stepped away twice when the emotion in a conversation caught him somewhere deep. Frank Delaney stood beside him most of the night, the way old friends stand beside someone when they understand a person needs something steady nearby. When it ended, James walked out to Main Street. His brothers were still there, folding chairs along the sidewalk, coffee from thermoses, quiet conversation, no hurry. He put on his helmet, started his bike. One by one, the others did the same. And Main Street filled with that sound again, low, steady, unmistakable, and the town stood on its sidewalks and watched them go. Have you ever misjudged someone the way the Mercers misjudged James? Or been on the other end, dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, and had to carry that quietly? Tell me in the comments. Because this story only means something if it connects to something real in your life. What's your take on this? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. If this story hit you somewhere, hit the like and send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, the other videos on this